Okay, Sunday school class in here today. This is a class by the time of the rest of the story, and it's really meant to pick up after the Advent Sunday school class we had, and the rest of the story is kind of, well, what happens after Advent and after Christmas. And today, I'll be talking about Epiphany. Next week, Henry Goodspeed is going to be talking about the presentation at the temple. And then January 22nd, Marie Maynard O'Connell will be in here teaching about the flight to Egypt. So those are the three segments we're going to have the next 3 weeks. So today, Epiphany. We are celebrating Epiphany in worship today. As those of you who are at 9 o'clock or the 8:30 service are aware, we'll be doing it again at 11. Epiphany is actually on the 6th, which was Friday. But we, as Presbyterians, celebrate Epiphany on the Sunday nearest the date, not on that date. So we're celebrating it today. That service was postponed until Monday, 7 o'clock tomorrow. So that's what they decided to do. So the fact that it is right up against kickoff of the national championship game, they didn't consult me about the change of time. So you are more than welcome to come to the 9 o'clock service, to the 7 o'clock service, St. Mark Episcopal on Monday at 7 o'clock. I'd love to have you come. Probably the sermon that I will preach there will be very similar to the one I'm preaching here today, because I'm not opposed to double dipping, and we'll see. But so you probably get a very similar sermon. What you won't get here is what they call the Three Kings procession, in which they get all dressed up. That's a big deal. And you won't get communion served by the bishop, which is what's going to happen over there. And you won't get a champagne reception afterwards, which is going to happen over there. There's a lot of stuff going on over there besides my sermon that may make it worthwhile to come. So. Okay, let's begin with prayer. God, we are grateful for your gift to us in Jesus Christ. Grateful for the way we celebrate that through the Christmas season, but also in this time of Epiphany. Open our hearts and minds to new learnings and new insights that may be helpful to us as we seek to grow in faith and follow Christ more faithfully. In his name we pray. Amen. So, what does Epiphany mean? Just the word epiphany, not in a religious context per se, but what's an epiphany? How would you define it?
Revelation.
Revelation, perfect. Unfolding, very good. Others? Realization, very good.
Going on.
Say that again.
Light bulb.
Light bulb, very good. Light is a big theme of Epiphany. Very good. So, one way to think about Epiphany is an experience of a sudden and striking realization. It's a new insight, a new truth. You might call it an aha moment. I don't mean to trivialize it in any sense, but I could have had a V8, right? That's not quite it, but it gets close to it. Epiphany actually comes from a Greek word, epiphania, which literally means appearance, or manifestation, or revelation, which is what you all have already talked about. One definition I came across, which was really helpful to me, epiphany means to make open and clear what used to be hidden and unclear. To make open and clear what used to be hidden and unclear, or covered up. So let's think about some epiphany moments or epiphany experiences, again, outside of the religious context, just for a moment to kind of help set the scene. So, a person who has been a smoker had this epiphany. I used to smoke a lot. Everyone let me know that it was bad for my health. However, I didn't pay any notice. One day, when I saw my 2 years of age offspring trying for a used cigarette butt within an ashtray, seeing this, suddenly it dawned upon me how terrible smoking was, and I stopped smoking. An epiphany, right? A new insight. I came across a couple from the world of science. The ancient Greek mathematician and physicist Archimedes was tasked with calculating the density of a gold crown to ascertain whether it was pure gold. He's not allowed to melt down the crown for his calculations. When he got in the bathtub to take a break from his work, hang with me, he realized that his volume displaced the same amount of water in the tub. He could use this fact to determine the volume of the crown and thereby the density. When he realized this, he famously cried out the Greek word eureka, which means I have found it. It was an epiphany. Someone else I was reading suggested that it probably was an epiphany for Isaac Newton when sitting below an apple tree. Apple tree fell on his head, which caused him to develop his universal law of gravitation, right? One more. This is from literature, one of my favorite books. I know favorite book of many of you, To Kill a Mockingbird. And I think there's an epiphany scene, epiphany near the end of the novel, when Scout is standing on Boo Radley's porch and realizes what Atticus has been trying to teach her throughout the story. And this is the way it goes. This is the narrative. I turned to go home. Street lights winked down the street all the way to town. I'd never seen our neighborhood from this angle. There was Miss Maudie's, Miss Stephanie's, there was our house. I could see the porch swing. Miss Rachel's house was beyond us, plainly visible. I could even see Miss DeBose's. Atticus was right. One time he said, you really never know a man, you never really know a man until you stand in his shoes and walk around in them. Just standing on the Radley porch was enough. A new sense of truth, a new sense of way of seeing the world. Epiphany. Let me give you one more, and I have used this in a sermon. It's a Fred Craddock story. You probably don't know what I do with Fred Craddock. That's a good story from. But this is, I think, in Epiphany as well. It moves us a little bit more in the direction of Christian faith. Fred Craddock tells how one night he and his wife were on vacation and were eating in a restaurant in the mountains of Tennessee. This elderly man came up while they were eating and started chatting with him, asking questions. After a while, found out Craddock was a minister. The old man said, I owe a very great deal to a minister. Pulled up a chair and started talking with them while they tried to eat. He told them a story. He said he was born in a little mountain town and that his mother was unwed. And he talked about what it was like to be an illegitimate child in a community like that. And how people stared at him and how people were cruel and excluded him. And some of them called him bastard. There was speculation, very often right there in his presence, speculation about who his father might have been. He said, when I got to be in my teens, I started going to a little church. They had a preacher who appealed to me and also scared me very much. He was a big bear of a man, huge, big beard. And I'd always go to hear him preach when I could, and always came in well after the service had started, and I left before it ended because I didn't want any of those people saying anything to me. He said, one day I didn't get out quickly enough. There were people standing in the aisle, and I was blocked. And to my horror, suddenly someone grabbed me from behind, this big, heavy hand, and I knew, and I turned. It was that preacher. He started studying my face, and I knew what he was doing, And sure enough, in a moment, he said, "Boy, you are a child of." I knew what was coming. I knew I was going to be shamed. I knew I'd never come back to that place. And the preacher went on, "Boy, you are a child of God. I can see a striking resemblance." Then he patted me on the bottom and said, "Now go and claim your inheritance." He said, my life really began that day. The story finished. Craddock asked the old man, "What's your name?" He said, "Ben Hooper." Craddock remembered how years ago his father had told them that the state of Tennessee had twice elected as governor a man named Ben Hooper, who was the child of an unwed mother. An epiphany. It changed his life. He saw himself, the world, everything in a whole new way. So, that's what epiphany is. It's a new insight. It's a new way of seeing truth. It's a new way of seeing the world. It is a way of viewing reality that we really hadn't before. And so, when we get to the religious part of Epiphany, it's interesting. It's interesting to me, and it may be interesting to you, that the early church started celebrating Epiphany, the Feast of the Epiphany, as early as the 4th century. We have records from the 4th century talking about the celebration of Epiphany. But you may be interested to know that there were really 3 events celebrated with the Feast of the Epiphany in the early church. One, of course, is the one we most closely associate with Epiphany, and that is the visit of the Magi. What we're talking about in worship this morning, Epiphany, right? That's what you think of. You see Epiphany, you see the wise men coming. You're right. So that's, I think, the one that's probably most common. But in the early church, another important part of Epiphany was Jesus' baptism by John in the Jordan River. Okay? So it wasn't just the visit of the wise men, it was Jesus' baptism after he grew up. And then the third one, it's also interesting to me. We're going to talk about each one of these and why they would be in the early church thought of as epiphany or epiphany moments, is Jesus' first miracle of changing water into wine. In the Gospel of John, Jesus changing water into wine was associated with Epiphany. So, the wise men or the Magi, the baptism of Jesus, and the changing water into wine. In the 4th century, that is all of that together made up the Feast of the Epiphany. Now, over the years, the church separated that out, and we have a Sunday in which we celebrate Epiphany, as we do, and then next week we're going to celebrate the baptism of the Lord. So we have separated those for good reasons. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. My point simply is, early on, this was a very early feast in the church, 4th century, and it included not just the visit of the wise men, it included the baptism, and included the changing of water into wine. So let's think a little bit about the passage from Matthew. It's one, again, that we're paying attention to, particularly in worship this morning. So let me read it to you. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is this child who has been born King of the Jews? For we have observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for see, for so has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. Upon entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Well, let's just think together a little bit about this story and why it would be understood or seen as an epiphany. You know, the reality is Matthew gives us very few clues who these guys were. Wise men, magi. So what kings? What is a magi? Magi is actually plural for magus, which doesn't help very much, does it? This is Greek. It's a Greek word that's actually in the original New Testament, the way Matthew wrote it. He describes these visitors as magoi or magi. We pronounce it magi. Well, you may know this. This may be very clear to you, but that is the word from which we get our word magic, right? Magi, magic, magician. It's a word actually that occurs elsewhere in the New Testament, but always negatively. It's a fellow in the book of Acts called Simon Magus. Remember him? It's the very same word as magi. And he was a sorcerer. And he had to quit being a sorcerer when he became a convert to Christ. There are speculations. Some think Matthew's magi may have been priests in the Near Eastern religion called Zoroastrianism, which was a kind of monotheistic religion that studied the stars quite a bit. They called their priests magi. And that's why there's some thinking that that's who these guys were. It's possible that these were simply astrologers of some other kind, first century scientists and philosophers. It's important though. Whoever they were, whatever they were, Matthew says nothing about them being kings. Okay? The reason we sing of them of being king, because it's a great song, it's very catchy, got a good tune and all that, it's a great song, we'll sing it again today. But the reason that they're called kings are not because of what the Gospel of Matthew says, but the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, speak on several occasions about kings bringing gold and frankincense to Zion. Isaiah chapter 60, verse 3, Psalm 68, verse 29, and Psalm 72, verse 10. And to give you an example of one of those, Psalm 72 says, "Yea, all kings shall fall down before him." And the early Christians interpreted Matthew in light of the Old Testament prophecies, and so they thought they would promote or elevate the Magi to kings, because that's what the Old Testament said. So that's how we got to kings. Are you with me? Does that make sense? Interestingly enough, Matthew also doesn't say how many Magi there were. Is that in there anywhere? No. Somebody was telling me one time they were preaching, talking about the three wise men. Some old cadre in the back row said, "Who said there were three?" Doesn't say there are three. We always say there are three. Why would we say there are three? What do you think? Three gifts, three men makes sense. But there are some early Christian paintings from the 2nd century of the wise men down in the catacombs underneath the city of Rome, and there were just two wise men. In the Middle Ages, there are documents that list 12 wise men and give all their names. We call that inflation. Right? So we don't know. There's a whole lot about these guys we don't know. Where they come from, well, all Matthew says is that they come from the east. Could have been from Persia, which is modern-day Iran. Could have been Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. Could have been from Arabia. We really don't know. All he does is say that they're from the east.
Why are they wise men?
Do I?
Why are they wise men?
Well, because they could have been sorcerers, astrologers, People who studied the stars, philosophers of some type. This is kind of how we got from Magi to wise men. These were, in that setting, probably very educated people. So what? Well, let me stop talking so much and ask you what's the epiphany here? What's the new insight that's revealed in this story of the Magi? If you heard my sermon at 8:30 or 9, don't blurt it out. What's the big deal here?
They weren't Jews.
They weren't Jews, exactly. They are from a foreign land. They represent Gentiles. I don't want to give everything away, but I'm going to tell you, they represent us. That's what the sermon says. They represent us. We were on the outside. They really represent, at least in Christian tradition, the whole world coming to worship Christ. If you look at the book of Matthew, it's interesting because this is a big important theme for Matthew. You know, Luke doesn't have wise men or magi or kings, whatever you want to think of them as. That story is not in Luke, it's not in Mark, it's not in John, it's only in Matthew. What's the last thing Matthew says at the end of his gospel? Go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. So there's a sense in which if you just read, and this is the challenge we have sometimes in Bible study or sermons and stuff, you know, if you just pick little snippets, as we do, snippets here and there, you don't sometimes get the longer connection of a passage in its context. But there is a sense in which, more than a sense, I think it's clear that this is a big deal for Matthew because he bookends his story this way. This first story is of people coming from foreign lands, not Jews, Gentiles, worship. And then the last thing he says, at the end of the book, is go and make disciples of all nations. For Matthew, this is a big deal. This is more than the King of the Jews. This is the King for the whole world. I think that's the epiphany. That's the revelation. Not just for the Jews, but for the whole world. I think Matthew is telling us that story at the beginning to point that out to us, and he sends us out at the end of his gospel to make that point as well. So questions, comments, responses, rebuttals? Henry?
Is there a possibility we could look through another lens at the same?
Sure.
And that would be maybe we're inside the tradition and they are outside the tradition, so that maybe we tend to put God in a box where he just talks to our tradition, but he doesn't talk to any people of any other faith. So there's Zoroastrian, and maybe we make our God too small.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think, you know, in this world, in the world that these folks lived in, there was Jew and Gentile. And Gentile was everybody else. So the fact that these, for Gentile, really was representing the outsiders. I think what Matthew is saying and wants to get us to realize is Matthew is not just for the covenant people. Jesus is really beyond. Jesus is really for the whole world. I think that's exactly what he's trying to do, I think.
And these guys came in with some information that generally the population didn't know.
Yeah, say another word about that. That's really interesting. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, they came in looking for Jesus, knowing that he was there, that the birth had occurred, and even the authorities didn't know this, apparently.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always, one of the things I do when, particularly passages like this that I've preached a number of times, you know, when I get ready to preach a new sermon or write a new sermon, I'll go back and look at ones I've done in the past. And I went back and looked at one I did a number of years ago, and it's kind of making that point that Ed was making, that I think is interesting here. These guys at least in this passage, you learn about Jesus from two very different sources. One is what we would call natural revelation, the star, right? It is something outside of the tradition. And we talk about that a lot, don't we? God being revealed through nature, God being revealed in the world. God isn't just revealed in the church or in the Bible. What we call general or natural revelation. Okay? So it's in this passage. The other thing that I pointed out in a brilliant sermon was that they know God through the Scriptures. That is, they interpreted for Herod the passage that talked about the ruler coming from Bethlehem. So my point of that great sermon was, you need to know your Scripture, and you need to keep your eyes open in the world, and God may become known to you. That wasn't a bad sermon, was it? Yeah.
Something that's really bothering me. I know it's just a song, but it's about 12 days of Christmas. And to me, the 12 days of Christmas, day number 1 would be December 25th through January 6th.
Right.
But that's not how people see it now. They start 12 days in front of Christmas, and I'm going, have they just lost what it means, or does it not matter? It just bothers me.
Yeah. I think what you're saying is really important because it bothered the early church had the same perspective you did. That is, I didn't say this earlier, I meant to, and I didn't. In the early church, Epiphany was a bigger deal than Christmas. That is, it wasn't just this birth, incarnation that we celebrated Christmas that was the big deal to the early Christians. It was the revelation of this child as king of the world. Not just king of the Jews, but the king of the whole world, the way we're talking about here. So, another way to think about it is, and rightly so, I mean, I'm not criticizing this by any stretch, but incarnation, Christmas that we celebrate by its nature, was a very local thing. Epiphany is this very local thing becoming known worldwide. Okay? So you got to have Christmas to have Epiphany, but in the early church it wasn't a great celebration about Jesus' birth. Born, okay. But who was born? It's when we come to understand through the Epiphany, we said revelation, manifestation, that which was hidden becomes well known. That was, in the early church, what the big deal celebration was about. And so that's why Epiphany was a bigger deal than Christmas. Does that make sense in terms of what you were saying?
Yeah. So now we're just wrong.
No, I don't say we're wrong. I think for good reason, the church separated those out. I mean, I think there's good reason for that. The notion of incarnation, the Word becoming flesh and all of that, it can stand on its own. All I'm saying is that in the early church, without the Epiphany, the birth would have been not that big a deal. The Epiphany, we wouldn't know about it. It would be a very local, narrow kind of thing, and now it's become a big worldwide kind of thing. And so that was the importance of the Epiphany, and that's why the early church put such an emphasis on it in a way that I mean, look at us. We put a big to-do about Christmas, but not so much about Epiphany. So, yes.
Since Matthew spent much of his time trying to convince the Jewish people that Jesus was truly the Messiah and relates back to the Old Testament, it's sort of an epiphany that he says these strangers know and recognize it. Well, obviously, a lot of them don't.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Matthew's task is really tough. Matthew begins with the genealogy. Now, why does he have the genealogy? Because he wanted the community, the readers, the people who heard his gospel, to know that Jesus was of the house of David. The connection with the Jewish people. That was absolutely essential. We're not starting brand new here. It's a big deal for Matthew to connect it to what has gone before. So he does it by doing the genealogy and showing, in essence, proving, if you will, through the genealogy that Jesus was of the house of David. That was a big deal. Without that, why would the Jews have cared about him at all, right? So that's part of Matthew's task. But it's not simply Matthew's task, because of what he comes to believe, simply to connect Jesus to the Old Testament, which he does, but he wants to say, but it's a lot bigger than that. He is the king for the whole world, not simply the king of Israel. So, yes, of the house of David, but a whole lot bigger. So it's really, he's got kind of two things he's trying to, 2 points he's trying to make. Does that make sense? Other thoughts? Yes.
Usually the house of David goes through the man rather than the female, and since he was born with the Spirit, how did they get that into their theology?
I didn't say they did it very well. I'm saying they were trying to make it work. I mean, that's really what they were trying to do. It's not totally logical to our way of thinking, but that was the purpose of the lineage, to connect into it. So I think, if I were to sum up what the Epiphany of the Magi is all about, I would say that at his birth, the Magi from foreign lands brought gifts, recognizing that this child would be a deliverer for all nations. He would fulfill the covenant with Abraham, which promised that in him all the peoples of the world would be blessed, going all the way back to Genesis 12. So the blessing with Abraham at the beginning was for all the world, and it comes true through the birth of Christ. That's the Epiphany. It's not just for this particular group, it's really for the whole world. Okay? Pretty big deal. Pretty big change, right? So let me press on, because I think this is important also. In the early church, they were celebrating Epiphany, and it wasn't just the wise men. They also linked it to Jesus' baptism. Baptism is told in all the gospel stories, but let me just read it to you from Matthew. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized him. John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and why do you come to me? But Jesus answered him, let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. Then he consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. You hear the Epiphany? You get the Epiphany? You see what's going on there? It's not just this little baby back here that was born. It's not just the visit of the Magi. He's grown up now. This is the voice of God saying who Jesus is. This is my Son. And it's done when? Again, not at Jesus' birth. Scholars mark Jesus' baptism as the beginning of his public ministry, because we don't know much about what happens from very early on in childhood until he's baptized. So this is the beginning of his public ministry. Epiphany is about taking things that were hidden and making them public. So Jesus begins his preaching and teaching and all this, and he begins it with his baptism. So do you see why, again, in the early church, they would connect the baptism of Jesus with the theme of Epiphany? Questions about any of that? Comments?
So you're saying the early church got it in terms of Matthew's gospel?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think for them, they recognized ultimately who Jesus was. And one of the ways it was most clear was at this baptism. I mean, if a voice from God comes and says it, that's pretty big a
Let's
bit.
talk about the others, if they realize they hit them about the Gentiles, it's the whole world.
I think the baptism, I think the visit of the Magi really made it a worldwide kind of thing. I think what this had to do more was with Jesus' identity as God's Son. Whether they got the universal nature of it or not, I'm not sure. But it has to do with the identity of God's Son. That was the epiphany. So it was an epiphany, but slightly different, if you will. So I don't know if that was behind your question, but that's a good way to think about it. John?
It sounds as if the end of Matthew is the source of missionary efforts all over the world. Missionaries going out to all around the globe and baptizing people. That's how they converted them to Christianity, through baptism.
Yes.
So it was hugely successful, and it sounds like Matthew's evidence.
Yes. Yes, that's exactly right. One of something hanging in my office was a pen and ink drawing by a woman who was in our graduating class in seminary. Wonderful artist, and she did this pen and ink drawing, and she made copies of them and gave it to all of us in the graduating class. We got to be friends over the 3 years we were there. And it is a drawing of the gate of the seminary, kind of looking from the inside out, and then she captions it at the bottom, go into all the world and make disciples of all nations.
Even artists.
I mean, it was yeah. I've been doing missionary work here for 15 years. There's a job. But that's it. I mean, and for us, it was go outside of the seminary gates. But it was the interpretation of that passage. It's really amazing. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
And why did Paul and Peter have so much trouble with this, if Matthew had already established this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I got to answer it in a way that may be surprising. But Matthew's gospel, most scholars think, wasn't actually written until after Paul's letters were written. That is, we make the assumption, that because they're chronologically, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, chronologically are first in the Old Testament, that that's the oldest literature. Scholarship thinks those were not actually written down until 65, 70, 75 AD, and then the Gospel of John 90, another 15, 20 years later. Paul's letters were written in the mid-century, 50, 55, 60, along there. So Paul is corresponding with churches that don't have written copies of the gospel.
So Matthew was just oral literature?
It was an oral tradition, and that's the thing that we have hard time getting hold of. To them, that wouldn't have been a problem. It was an oral tradition. We live in a literary, written tradition. Some people think it's now changed to a computer, where everything's online. But we are, the written word is what we give authority and meaning to. For them, the oral tradition lived for 40, 50 years before it's written down. And that's okay, because that's the way they communicate.
Well, also, they had more than 10
Well, maybe so. Maybe so. So Paul was really dealing with people who had questions about the faith and tradition and all that, but didn't have the Gospels that he could point to. See, it says right here, it just wasn't a resource. That's a good question. Let's talk briefly, as we move along here, with the third part of the Epiphany. And I will tell you, I knew the Epiphany with the Magi, and I've read a little bit about the baptism, and I knew, Now, next Sunday, we're doing Epiphany today, and we're going to do baptism next Sunday because, I think that's connected, and I get that, and that's why that's done that way. So that wasn't a surprise to me. The one that was more a surprise to me when I read about it was that the third story event in Jesus' life that was in the 4th century church. See what I'm telling you? I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying what was important to them, the Magi, the baptism, and the changing of water into wine. The changing of water into wine. So let me just read that one to you to remind you that story. On the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, they were the Episcopalians, not his. The steward called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But that's not a comment on Episcopalians. I'm married to Episcopalian. She grew up at the Episcopal Church. She joined the Presbyterians, I think, out of self-defense, but she had great affection for the Episcopalians. Just be careful. But you have kept the good wine until now. Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. The word revealed is the same word that we've been using through all of this. Epiphania. It revealed his glory. Okay? So you see how the early church would get that. So, now why would this be a big deal?
The blood of Jesus. The wine represents the blood of Jesus, which has been shed for us.
She says the wine represents the blood of Jesus, which has been shed for. That's one interpretation. I think that's really good. Any others? Well, good Jews at that time would have known something that probably most of us don't know, and that is that Amos chapter 9, verse 13 says that when God's kingdom comes, when God's new reign has dawned, the mountains will drip with sweet wine, and all the hills will flow with it. So wine was a standard symbol for the coming of the kingdom. So what does Jesus do? He changes water into wine, and the early church interpreted that as an epiphania, as an epiphany. The new reign, God's new kingdom is here in the person of Jesus, who has turned water into wine. They would have known that that was a standard symbol from the Old Testament, that when God's new kingdom comes, wine will be flowing. Okay? Comments, questions? Yeah, Ed?
I'm going to play off of what Sandra said. Do you think Jesus would have done this if his mother had not intervened?
It's really interesting. It's really interesting, and I'm not really well prepared to address it now because I haven't thought about it in a while, but when I've done research on that passage, there's a lot of work done on that very line where Jesus says, "Woman, what has that to do with you and me?" That is that a distancing? Jesus distancing himself from his mother? You can read it that way. Or is there a term of endearment in there? Other scholars have suggested that it wasn't, I think it's traditionally been interpreted as kind of a Jesus separating himself from his mother. You know, nobody's going to control me. I'm going to do it. You know, my time has not yet come. That's one way it's been, that some scholars have interpreted. But there's others who have said, no, there's more of a feeling of endearment in here. And so there's some different ways of thinking about how that, which is an odd phrase in the middle of this thing. You know, she says they have no wine. What does that have to do with you and me?
And then she also says, go do go do it. I'm telling you to go do it.
But he tells it to the stewards, not to him. He tells it to the servants, not to them. But it's really interesting what's going on there between Jesus and his mother, and there's some different ways you can look at that. Chuck?
In other Sunday school classes, it's been pointed out that wine is the highest level of purification. People got sick from drinking wine, so they drank wine. And so if water turned to wine, that shows the supremacy of Jesus.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. That's good.
That phrase, woman, used to really bother me until Alan Smith preached a sermon on it. And he was of the opinion that woman was a term of endearment.
Was a closer term, not a distance.
That made me feel a lot better.
Okay.
I remember it from
Obviously, yes, that's good.
lots of years ago.
Yeah. So, wine as a symbol of the new kingdom is one way, at least, to think about this as an epiphany. And it makes sense to me, then, why the Magi, the baptism, and the water into wine are all epiphanies. We'll go back to something Cyril asked, because I kind of got me thinking a little bit in a way that I hadn't thought about before. So there are epiphanies, but about slightly different things. This is my interpretation. I'm not saying this is Holy Writ. I'm just saying this is my interpretation. But if these three events in the life of the early church make up Epiphany, one epiphany is that this is not just a local king or the king of a particular people or the king of the Jews. This is a king for the whole wide world. They didn't talk about this, but, well, sidetracked on that. But that's why Herod is so threatened, so paranoid. This guy's going to take over. That's what he thinks. So, the first epiphany, the Magi, the whole world, not just this narrow corner of God's earth, right? The epiphany in the baptism, God's voice says, this is my son. You may just think he's a good teacher. You may just think he's a smart guy. This is my son, the beloved. So he gives a particular identity on Jesus. And then the third is, my kingdom is breaking in. If this notion of water into wine, wine being symbolic of the coming of the new age, when the hills and valleys will flow with wine, that's what it's saying. So, three kinds of epiphany, but all together a revelation for the whole world. God's Son, God's kingdom is here. That's pretty big stuff, isn't it? All right, I'm going to stop there because I got to get ready for church. If you haven't heard the Epiphany sermon, stay and hear it. You get a little dose of what you heard here, but mostly focusing on the end. Thank you all very much. Next week, Henry will be leading and talking about the presentation of the temple. Thank you all.